hit the record button. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Dani Marchetti. I am one of the electronic records archivists here at the New Jersey State Archives, as well as a member of the SERI Education and Programming Subcommittee. First, I want to welcome you guys to today's webinar, starting from the bottom. Today's webinar will consist of a presentation with time for quick Q&A at the end. And the presentation will be on the New Jersey State Archives ground-up approach to developing a workflow with the help of backer consultant Nick Connizzo. We will get started in just a minute, but until then, I just want to draw your attention to a few upcoming events within the community. So stay tuned for news on upcoming webinars. But until then, we do have some exciting news within the SERI community. The Preservica user group is back. We will be meeting on Monday, May 20th at 3 p.m. So if you're interested in joining this group, please contact Becky Jolson and we will get you signed up so that you can attend. As for upcoming events, the SERI Steer-On Conference is scheduled for Thursday, May 16th from 12 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time, and that focuses on accessibility. Registration is now open, so don't forget to register for that. Also keep in mind the Best Practices Exchange Conference is going to be at California State University Library in Sacramento from June 10th to 12th. Nagara will be held in Atlanta, Georgia from July 16th to the 19th. And of course, the COSA Annual Conference is going to be held September 18th to 20th in St. Louis, Missouri. Proposal deadlines are due April 19th, so tomorrow, so be sure to get those in. And also, just as a reminder, SERI webinars are recorded and are available on our website and YouTube channel. Okay, so before we start, I just wanted to say a quick thank you to our 2024 sponsor, Preservica. And before we get into today's webinar, the SERI Education and Programming Committee has a short poll we'd like to ask you to fill out. The questions are just going to help us better serve you and get the most out of SERI. So just take a minute to do that. And now we will get started here. So just to introduce you all to today's speakers, Nick Connizzo is currently a project manager for the COSA Backer Project, as well as a digital archivist at Norwich University in Vermont. He's been a digital archivist and digital preservation consultant for over a decade, previously with George Washington University and the state of Vermont, and has been working with SERI and COSA since 2015. Tara Maharjan is the Senior Electronic Records Archivist for the New Jersey State Archives. She holds master's degrees from Simmons College in History and Library Science with a concentration in archives, as well as a Digital Archives Specialist Certificate from the Society of American Archivists. Before working at the State Archives, she worked for Rutgers University Special Collections and University Archives, the Internet Archive, and as a cookbook librarian for America's Test Kitchen. And again, I'm Dani Marchetti. I have a master's degree from Rutgers University in Information Science, where I also work as a virtual reference librarian. I also have a Digital Archives Specialist certification from the Society of American Archivists, and I have worked in various roles here at the New Jersey State Archives for the past 6 years before becoming an electronic records archivist. Before we get into the actual webinar today, and I pass things off to Nick, we have another short poll with a few quick questions regarding your institution and their workflows. So if you guys could take a minute to fill that out, that would be really appreciated. I'll just give everyone a minute here. Alrighty, and thank you guys for filling that out. And now I'm just going to pass things along to Nick to give you a little bit of information about the Backer Grant.
Great, thank you. And thank you everyone for coming. I've looked over the participant list. I obviously see a number of names that are familiar, so thank you for returning if you've been to one of these before. This is probably the third, I think, or maybe the fourth time I've talked about Backer. So I'm going to talk only a very little bit about the project itself. I would refer you to the Council of State Archivists Backer website, which I'll throw in the link after I'm done talking here. So if you want to learn more or see those other presentations, we've kind of done a deeper dive on some of these topics in the past. But I'm just going to introduce the grant itself and the project work that we've been doing over the last 3 years or so as a backdrop to how we got started here. So Backer is a national leadership grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services from 2021 to 2024. And as it says here, there's a bunch of different outcomes that we're hoping for. But for the most part, we are trying to, one, update this program of self-assessment that the archives have been, state archives and territorial archives have been conducting since 2012. So we're kind of trying to sustain this project to gather long-term longitudinal data about the digital preservation capability of our state and territorial archives. Second part is a direct assistance and mentoring program. That's a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. That is aimed at building those digital preservation capacities and capabilities. And then lastly, we wanted to accelerate and build a community of practice around digital preservation planning, cultural competence, skill building, training, development of expertise, kind of everything related to the management and the administration of the digital archives and the statewide digital preservation program. So these are some ambitious goals, and I think we've been pretty successful so far, but you'll have to judge that for yourself as we continue talking. You can go to the next slides. Sorry, I thought I was moving us forward. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the self-assessment. That kind of gives us the backdrop for why we're here today. So it's based on something called the Digital Preservation Capability Maturity Model. Again, that'll be linked on our website, which I'll share the link with you. But it was chosen at the beginning of our grant, one, because we have done it several times before in 2012 and 2015. Now we've done it in 2020, 2022, and now 2024 again. We just concluded our most recent set of self-assessments. And it really is just a general model that seeks to evaluate both services that are provided by a digital archives and also the infrastructure that supports it. And really, we're looking at not just the capabilities at the archives, capital A, as an organization itself, but really across the entire enterprise of state government or territorial government. We all know today that digital preservation is something that has to be conducted from the beginning of the records life cycle all the way through disposition and the end of it. So, mistakes or complications or decisions that are made at the beginning of the life cycle, they tend to cascade and provide us with things that we have to untangle later. And in many cases, that ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure down the road. So we're really trying to front load as much of the thought about digital preservation as we can to that beginning part of the life cycle, even though historically archives have not necessarily always been involved in that beginning part of the life cycle, though our records management companions, our colleagues have been. And then lastly, we're continuing to evaluate and evolve the way we think about things. The digital preservation capability maturity model is great for looking at 15 major elements related to, again, those infrastructure and services, but it's also been around since 2012, and we're continuing to update and reinforce and think about the ways that we evaluate ourselves. You can move to the next slide, please. So when we take these baselines, not just the survey data that was compiled at the beginning of 2020, but really looking comprehensively of over the last 12 years or so of assessments to create these kind of targeted assistance projects, which are intended to be right-sized. There's no single template for them. Some of our backer projects are, me working for a short time with an individual archivist. Others are comprehensive and kind of involve everybody in the state archives, and then most of them are somewhere in between. So it really is, not COSA coming in and trying to dictate what or how to do it. It's really trying to understand what your needs are today and to get you to the next level. A big part of the challenge we have in the past, this is COSA and State Electronic Records Initiative SERI, is being able to turn good advice and good guidance into tools that people can actually use. So this is kind of our approach to get really boots on the ground and figure out, well, what are the are the real issues that are at play. Take it out of the world of theory and best practice and into the world of, well, we actually have deadlines and we have how many hours per week and how many staff members have to be involved and who has a say in what process and things like that, which really only crop up in once you're actually starting to do the work. So the advantage of the direct assistance projects is that you're really doing things. And we're going to talk a lot about more of that later. So some of the things that we've worked on are workflow and policy development, high-level advocacy, and then specific targeted advocacy as well, mostly towards our records producers and our IT agencies who often need, a little bit of help or a little bit of reframing of the problem in order to kind of get to the goals that we both share. And then obviously a big part of the workflow generation is that implementation of tools, platforms, services, systems, whatever you want to call them, the things that we use to do the job. And so we've had 6 projects over the course of the last few years. Again, some of them have been pretty big and comprehensive, and others have been pretty small. You can see them there, and not to foreshadow too much, but probably in a few months, you'll see us back here and we'll be talking about each of these projects in a little bit more depth, kind of giving an overview of them. But today we're all going to be focusing about the state of New Jersey and our work with them. So I'll turn it over to Tara now, and she can tell us where they started from.
So I'm going to jump right in and give you guys a little bit of information and background information about the New Jersey State Archives electronic records program and kind of how we got started. So the State Archives has been pushing to begin an electronic records program for the past 30 years, and they finally began the process in 2018. The program had sort of a backward start, as Tara and I like to say. So first, Preservica was purchased in 2018 with no designated staff in place. And then I, the junior level archivist, was hired in early 2022, and I immediately went out on maternity leave. And then once I came back from maternity leave, Tara, the senior level archivist, was hired at the end of 2022. So almost a year later. And usually the ideal timeline of events obviously would have been for Tara to be hired and then to choose a software and to hire junior level staff. But that did not happen for us. So we just tried to make the most of our sort of backward situation. And to do that, we started to build the program from the ground up. So because we had such a big task ahead of us, we decided it would be best to lay out priorities and to identify specific needs. So we started to make some general decisions, and to make a long story short, we chose first a metadata standard, which we chose Dublin Core because of its simplicity and its wide acceptance in the field. For an FTP, we are using FileZilla Pro. That's not necessarily what we asked for, but it's what the state was willing to give us. So we took what we could get. And in terms of fixity, we chose to use SHA-256 simply because it's secure enough and it's widely accepted and used in the field. And from what we researched, we found that SHA-1 is sort of being phased out. And we kind of thought that SHA-512 was a little bit more powerful than we necessarily needed. So we started to work on learning how to use Preservica, since that was chosen for us. So besides just general functions, we needed to learn how to use the bulk ingest function, bulk metadata editing functions. We needed to learn how to set up migration rules and how to conform to their new OPEX metadata packages. So we started to write up guides on how to utilize these tools and functions, which would become part of our larger documentation. So continuing on with documentation, we researched and selected preferred and acceptable file formats. And we adopted file naming and file organization standards from the State of New Jersey Bureau of Records Management, who we actually split from back in 2012. So now, even though records management is under the Department of Treasury and we are under the Department of State, we obviously need to collaborate pretty often with them because of how intertwined our work is. So here you can see some examples that we took from the New Jersey Records Manual. These are pieces that will become part of our larger documentation, part of our policy and procedural manuals. And it was during this time that we started to also reach out to a lot of other states and institutions to discuss their documentation, their policies, procedures, and any suggestions that they might have for us as a program who is just getting started. So another part of these conversations were discussions on hardware. So at first we looked into getting a Fred machine, which is generally used for digital forensics. We ultimately decided against this because our focus is mostly geared on foreign digital material, and we decided a better option for us would be a designated workstation with Bit Curator. So by using Bit Curator, we could kind of select our own tools and programs, which were more specific to the archival community and to our needs. So we asked for a custom built computer with the following specs you can see on the screen. And we pretty much got what we had asked for, with the exception of a dual boot. We only got a Linux machine, and we are told by IT that they don't support a dual boot or Linux in general. So that's something we'll have to deal with, is not having any IT support on that going forward. But from there, we installed Bit Curator and started to experiment with some of the tools and applications in that environment. So once we got all of that in place and set up, we decided we were ready to see what we were dealing with in terms of electronic records. So we decided to develop a survey to send out to the state agencies that we would eventually be taking records from, basically to find out the extent of their holdings and the formats they were using, the size of their holdings, things like that, so we could start to prepare on our end. So it's about this time that we started to work with Nick as part of the Backer project, and Nick and Tara will talk to you a little bit more about the survey that we developed and then the workflow that we developed from there.
So as Dani mentioned, when she and I started in our roles as the electronic records archivist, the New Jersey State Archives did not have the capabilities to accession electronic records. So materials were generally not taken. While there were some discs that came in with paper-based collections, born digital materials were not accepted. So while this means that we technically have no backlog, we also have a 30-year backlog worth of materials that are out there for us. So in order to prepare for the born digital materials, we wanted to ensure we had the necessary technologies and workflows in place to handle things like removable media, obsolete or proprietary file types, sensitive information, as well as enough space to properly store and preserve the records. And of course, think about Dani and my time and how we're going to manage all of that. Since there are only two of us working in the electronic records department unit right now, we wanted to ensure that we were using our time wisely and knowing what to expect from each agency and create a better plan. So with this survey, we wanted to be very clear that we were only interested in the permanent historical records, which have permanent disposition or archival review with us at the State Archive. So because of this, we wanted agencies to start considering things like their records retention schedule before they were even thinking about transferring the materials to us. We had a lot of things that we wanted to come out of this survey, and we feared that we were going to forget to ask things. And we really only had one shot to kind of give these presentations to the agencies. So we wanted to ensure we captured all of the needed information. So collaborating with Nick allowed us to have a sounding board to help work through what information we were really going to need, but also what to do with that information when we got it. So here are the first few questions that we asked as part of our survey. Very straightforward: name, agency, department, contact information. But again, we really wanted to focus on what their records schedule number was, so that they would actually need to look at their record schedule and make sure that they actually knew whether it was supposed to have permanent disposition in the archive or whether it needed archival review. We also wanted to ask about file size of the transfer, so we could start planning for storage needs on our end. We also got a little bit into the nitty-gritty of questions themselves, of starting to think about, does this information have personally identifiable information, and are they actually aware of it? Do they have any kind of organization to their records? So whether their records have a hierarchy. So this, again, we are pointing back to that records manual that Dani showed a snippet of before. Not to shame any agency if they weren't organized or things, but so that we knew how to plan for the materials that were coming, but also so that they could start thinking about how they were organizing their materials moving forward. We also wanted to plan for the transfer itself. So we're asking about where these files are being stored. so that if we were dealing with something like magnetic media, we could think about the forms of technology we would need to remove them. But then again, if things were on hard drives or in cloud storage, they may be easier to deal with. Or if they're on things like servers that may not be easily accessible, we may need other players involved. So we may be needing to be contacting OIT to get access to those servers. So we really were trying to figure out how to plan accordingly. Our survey is 20 questions long. So far, we have presented this survey to all of the agencies in the Department of State, as well as a few others who have reached out to the State Archive and are interested in sending over their electronic records. The one thing that we have gotten out of these presentations is that a few agencies have now either had records retention schedules made who previously did not have one, or have gotten corrections made. So this is also going to be great for us moving forward. So Dani and I knew that from the beginning, we wanted to create a manual, which was a step-by-step process to allow anyone to come in and understand how to do our work. I came to the State Archives from an institution that relied heavily on institutional knowledge of how things were done. And I know I took a lot of that knowledge with me when I left. So I wanted to ensure that if the time came that someone got hit by a bus, we won the lottery, moved institutions, whatever it is that happened, we were ready for someone to either step into that role and to understand what it is we were doing. So after we finalized our survey with Nick, we knew we wanted to focus on this workflow, which also meant figuring out how our work fit into the larger work of the New Jersey State Archives. We have a collection management team who is responsible for the appraisal and accessioning of materials. And now that we have and are thinking about electronic records, we also need to be thinking about the technical appraisal of the materials, not just the content appraisal. So here's our pre-appraisal steps that we created. First is the survey. If the agency indicates that they are ready to transfer materials, then we would bring collection management into the conversation so they can begin the content appraisal. Then if collection management decides that the material should be coming to the archive, Dani and I would work with the agency to talk about things like transferring. This document is not final yet, but this is what collection management plans to send to agencies as a pre-accessioning form. So similar to how they would go out to an agency and look through the boxes and folders before they would come to the archive, this document is really saying that these materials are just for us to look over. It's not a legal transfer yet, but also that they should not alter the documents after they are sent to us, and that after the files are accessioned by the State Archive, they become legally owned by the State Archive, and that if they retain copies of these materials, they will still be responsible for open records requests. Behind the scenes, this is the workflow and kind of how it would break down. So the electronic records department, so Dani and I, will use BitCurator to create the file manifest, establish fixity, as we assume we will not be able to get the agencies to do that before they send us the materials. Check for viruses, generate PII and file format reports for the collection management team, who are then also working on reviewing the files before accessioning the materials. So at that point, if we decide we are going to session the materials, both teams will work together to create a processing plan if needed. If that is the case, then Dani and I move forward with our processing workflow. So as Dani mentioned, we decided on BitCurator as part of our workflow, which obviously led us to more questions, more things to figure out, and more conversations with Nick. One issue that we came across quickly was we did not have any files to work with. So we needed to practice using the different programs to see what was going to work best for us. So we needed to create files and create a file structure to work with, which also meant adding to Nick's to-do list of eventually creating some sample files for others who were kind of in this field. And trying to figure out what, as they're playing around with BitCurator and figuring out their process, to have something that they can work with to make sure that it's working the way they want to be working. We also needed to determine what personally identifiable information was for us. So when I asked my colleagues, the answer that I received was basically, I know it when I see it, which I think is how a lot of us think about PII, but it's less helpful when you're trying to write the expressions that are needed to run a PII report in BitCurator. So it actually forced us as an agency to sit down and create a list of what our PII is. So in addition to the things that we would normally think about, like social security numbers, in the state of New Jersey, we have something called Daniel's Law, which protects the home addresses and telephone numbers of active, formerly active, and retired judicial officials, prosecutors, and law enforcement officers, as well as their immediate families, which meant that we needed to think about some other expressions that maybe we weren't part of the norm. I know that this was really hard to read, but as we were figuring out what programs we needed to use, for those who are not familiar with BitCurator, it is a suite of open source digital forensics and digital analysis tools to help cultural heritage institutions process their born digital materials. So these are a number of tools that just do the analysis. BitCurator has a lot of programs that do the same or similar work or that work with one another. So Nick was really helpful in helping us navigate what programs we wanted to use and how to use them. Outside of our work with Nick, we also needed to figure out our Preservica workflow. As Dani mentioned, Preservica was decided before either of us were hired, and she was great at learning on how to ingest materials into Preservica before I arrived, but often that was on the item level, which was not going to be very helpful as we moved forward. So to bulk ingest materials in Preservica, you need to use the .opex file extension, which is their custom metadata package to help maintain file structure when uploaded. At first, we were able to use an Excel spreadsheet with a macro to generate the .opex files, but it required a lot of manual input. So we needed to figure out how to create these .opex files in an easier manner for us, which meant creating a Python code, which I unfortunately did not have any experience with. So I needed to figure out how to do that. Here is just a quick example of my Python code. It creates the file structure for us. And so on the screen, it is running my code. I put in the top level file path that I need, and then it generates the file structure and the documentation. So you can notice the file name changed. And then here is the .opex material needed. And the folders within also get the same OPEX material. So it doesn't give a lot of, it doesn't have any metadata with it. It's really only pulling the file name. So we will still need to do some bulk editing once these materials are in, but this at least allowed us to get a start and not have to do so much work manually. So this is where I'll pass it off to Nick to talk about the work on his end.
Great, thank you. So, you know, when we came to the project, COSA and SERI, this was in towards the beginning of 2023, and we were looking at about a year and a half until the end of the grant with which we could provide some direct assistance. So we started out with the score that was taken by both Tara and Dani, but also by their predecessors. So we kind of looked at both versions of what they had done, and we identified, certainly from our end, we identified some strengths, such as having good technical expertise, and then a lot of the OAIS, that's the Open Archival Information System, functions that we would come to expect. You know, ingest, storage, data integrity, metadata, and access. As Tara mentioned, they had access to Preservica already as their digital repository solution. And we'll be talking a little bit about that, but having that in place meant that what we could focus on, the things that we could improve, which were specifically our policy, our strategy, governance, collaboration with our records producer agency, and of course the workflow from getting things from the agency into the digital repository. So that pretty much has been our focus. We haven't done that much or had that much conversation about what happens once they get ingested into their digital repository, but that is certainly part of the consideration as well, because again, as I mentioned, the decisions that we make early on in the process do have implications later. So if you could move us forward one slide, I'm going to talk about very briefly about the State Electronic Records Preservation Framework. This is called SERP. Part of the Backer grant, we are obligated to update the SERP framework, which was originally published in 2014. And it was originally very closely modeled after the DPCMM, but we've gone ahead and kind of decoupled it a little bit for the modern incarnation because DPCMM, for most of us who are archivists or records professionals, a lot of it makes sense talking about OAIS and talking about the different repository functions. But as I mentioned, we're trying to focus a lot of our work towards the entire life cycle of records and the entirety of government. And so when you start talking about OAIS with a general counsel or a records producer or someone at an agency, their eyes gloss over and you lose them very quickly. So we try to simplify and really talk about the major things that we are caring about. And those are essential record keeping requirements, roles and responsibilities, systems governance, migrations, and authorized access to public records. Why each of the, I'll just tell you why we focus on these. The first is record keeping requirements. And what we're talking about here are, of course, our statutory requirements related to retention, disposition, and protection of data. But we're also talking about administrative requirements, technical requirements. As Tara mentioned, we had some technical requirements as part of this process, such as we have BitCurator available, we have Preservica as our destination, we may or may not be transferring records through FTP. So there are some technical requirements that we have to work around in thinking about how to build our capacity here. Roles and responsibilities also really essential because the requirements tell us what we have to do or what we need to do. The roles and responsibilities hopefully inform us on who's going to do them. We don't want to be in a situation, as many archives are, of being stuck trying to do everything, especially the things that we are not equipped to do. So a really good example is that identification of PII and other restricted information. We have some good knowledge and we have some good tools, but the people who are best positioned to know whether records have PII in them are the people that created those records, because they'll know the content. So it's things like that. So how much of this and what can we try to push forward into different parts of this process so that our burdens are relieved in a way that is, equitable and fair and produces the best outcome. I think that's where we're going with all of this. So we know, what has to be done, who's going to do it. Digital systems governance, this tells us whether the tools that we have, whether it's our repositories of data or our migration tools or whatever it might be, whether they can actually handle meeting those requirements. So it's really hard to do retention on digital records in a system if we don't know any of those records are created. That's going to be a real problem for us. It's really difficult to manage the disposition of records if none of those records have titles or names or context for what they are, right? So those are really simple examples, but you would be surprised, actually maybe most people on this call wouldn't be surprised, how many digital systems that are in place in state government don't have some of this functionality that we would consider to be very basic. So we want to be looking at these systems, and it's not just trying to encourage the development and procurement of ones that can do the things we need, but it's also optimizing the systems that we have. There are thousands and thousands in state government, and some that are really commonly used, like Microsoft Office and Exchange and Outlook and things like that, that we can kind of, develop a standard of practice that really should be applicable in a lot of places. Migrations are another huge essential part of this. And that's a big part of the workflow we're talking about today, which is, 3 different contexts. One is custodial transfer, so transfer of records from a producing agency to the archives. Obviously, we need to figure out the governance around that to make sure that works. Second one is moving from system to system. We know that when data gets migrated from one system to another, data can be lost, formats can be changed, context can be damaged. So we want to make sure that when that happens, as much of the kind of original, that digital provenance, is retained as we can. And then lastly, we know that over time, the format and structure of data records needs to change because our ability to play back is not there anymore. So we might be talking about a very simple change, like a migration from a Word document to a PDF. Or we might be talking about something much more complicated, like a big database that needs to be migrated into a bunch of individual tables or spreadsheets or whatever it might be. Obviously, some of these things all collide at the same time. So when we're talking about records transfers from an agency to an archives, Usually we're talking about extraction from one digital system, maybe transformation of the data into a different format, and then a custodial transfer as part of it. So all of these things are really essential to the preservation of digital of data and digital records. So we need to be thinking about those as well. And then we can't lose sight of access. Obviously, that's why we're doing this. We want to make sure that the ability to access the information is not damaged anytime throughout the process. So whether it's a FOIA or any type of public records request at the agency or access through the archival repository, we're thinking about our capabilities on that front. Can you push us to the next slide, please? And you'll see that when we think about workflows, there's a little bit of a rhyme here in that we're thinking about what are our requirements. So Tara mentioned some of them, such as BitCourier, FTP, Preservica, staff time, our availability to work on things, how much time we have to process, things like that. Roles and responsibility, who's going to do what in each in various sections of the workflow, what systems are we going to use, what tools are we going to use to process and manipulate and survey our data. And of course, with any workflow, we know that every step is both a part of a larger process, but also has an input and an output in order to make things move along. A lot of times our workflows break down because the outputs of one step don't match the inputs of another. So we might expect a package of records from an agency, but instead we get it in a weird format that doesn't really make sense. So we want to try to cast a wide net and make sure that all of our workflow steps have both discrete inputs that we can be flexible about, but also consistent, transparent, well-documented outputs so that everybody knows both inside our agency and out what we're doing and why. And one thing I'm going to do here, and it's not strictly required as part of this presentation, but I'm going to share a draft of our workflow in the chat, so everybody should be able to access it. Feel free to take a copy, and if you want to contact us, maybe not right this second, but later with questions or comments, I'm happy to talk about this more. This is a draft workflow that we've worked on, so it's a few pages long, and you can see the different workflow steps because I'm not going to talk about them in great detail today, though we may do so in the future with another presentation. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about our workflow, as you'll see in this document, really we're talking about 5 major steps, though of course each of those is broken down into a bunch of smaller steps. But when we think about the work that we're doing, we're really talking about this pre-appraisal and extraction. So this is kind of at the agency side. How do we get the right data out of the digital its source system and to the archives? Well, that second part of that process is the transfer and ultimately the accession at the archives. Then what does the archives need to do in order to process the records so we can preserve it appropriately and of course provide access to it? Then we want to get everything structured correctly, and once that processing is done, we ingest it into our digital repository, and then lastly provide access to it. So that's really what we're thinking about in kind of at a 10,000-foot level, and that's how we build the different steps to the workflow. And I'm going to talk a little in depth about a little bit of each of those. So we're going to start with. Oh, sorry. There's a couple other considerations we need to think about that don't really fall into any of those categories, but these are in the back of our mind. One is timeline. It really does matter quite a bit whether the agency transfers records to you. We want them, for example, to hold a copy until we tell them that the transfer is complete and that all the data is secure on our end. It's a lot easier for an agency to wait for a week to do that than it is for them to wait 2 years to do so. We need to, again, when we process records, especially if we're handing it off from one archivist to another, if there's a 2-year backlog and we know that someone's not going to get to it for a long time, we might want to do different things to make sure the data is secure and its integrity is preserved than we would if it's just, I'm going to leave for the day and I'll finish tomorrow. The other things we're considering are efficiency. How efficient are our workflows? It's great to have a workflow that is in depth and produces the most detailed, beautifully structured, well-described records. But if we're taking in, 1 million digital objects a year, we're not going to individually describe them all with 2 people. It's just not going to happen. So we need to figure out how to efficiently process our materials and kind of conduct these because I don't know, if you're in archives that has a ton of money available, contact me and I'll ask you how you do it. And then lastly, there's scalability. We know that we're starting with something that is small. We're going to take in a few collections, but over time, especially as we develop our bona fides and kind of continue to do this, that everybody's going to be transferring records to us eventually. So we're going to need to be able to process and accept transfers, maybe 2 a week or 5 a week or 10 a week or multiple per day, depending on how things go. Most states have dozens or even hundreds of agencies that may be wanting to transfer them records every year. So we need to be thinking about how to scale this up in the future. Next slide. Oh, thank you. So the first step is this pre-appraisal and this extraction step. And the major things that we're considering are, one, how to actually select records. How does the agency figure out which of their records are archival, hopefully using a record schedule, how to actually manage getting them out of their source system. Tara was talking about this kind of survey previously. How can we, as part of the state archives, whether it's our collections management or our electronic record section or whatever it might be, how can we facilitate this at the agency? How do we inform them what needs to be taken out of their systems? It's not just the record, it's also the metadata, and it's also the context. And obviously structure is a big part of that as well. And then lastly, how do we identify this restricted content, this restricted data that's in our records, such as PAI, PHI, statutory exemptions, whatever they might be? Because again, who is the best to be able to find that and do something with it? Next, we think about the transfer. So after the agency has extracted the data out of their system, whatever it is, how do they actually transfer it to us, and what do we do as part of this process? So how much of this is happening from kind of a network transfer, or just within the state's existing systems, and how much of it is coming from like a legacy media or legacy device, so old hard drives or old servers or removable disks or DVDs or CDs or things like that. When the records come to us, how do we verify that what they sent us is both what they intended to send us, but also it didn't get damaged along the way? Where do we put them when they get here? And then what are we looking for when we do this survey? Because once again, this is a really critical part of the process, because this is when we're going to work out all those issues that we might not be able to solve ourselves, or the producer is better and more efficiently able to solve those problems. So for example, if records are stored as high resolution TIFFs in the agency system, but when they export them, there are low resolution JPEGs that come to us, we can't really undo that process. We can convert a JPEG to a TIFF again, but we can't really restore the resolution that was lost as part of that export process. So these are the times where we want to be able to go back to the agency and say, hold up, what are you doing? How are you doing it? And is there a way that we can kind of refine this process so that when you do transfer stuff to us, no signal is lost, no fidelity is lost, and most of all, no data is lost? Because if we lose it as part of this transfer, we haven't really done our job. We obviously want to be looking for the standard things that we're looking for as part of a digital processing project. So viruses and malware, any files that are just totally unusable, and then obviously again that PII, PHI restricted content. All that is very critical to identify as early in the process as we can. Then when we talk about processing, we're really talking about two kind of major sets of actions. The first are these digital preservation actions. Some of us, if you're thinking about something like premise, these are your premise events, such as, remediating malware problems, fixing any unreadable, unidentifiable problem files, resolving any contextual links. So for example, if you have email that might have a signature block that links to a different place, like how are we resolving that data? Are we just ignoring it, or are we trying to capture it at the time of trying to crawl and kind of get data from our linked sources, or how are we dealing with that? And then what normalization strategy are we going to have? So are we going to be doing file format migrations as part of the transfer or ingest, or are we going to kind of kick the can down the road? And then obviously we have long-term actions to be thinking about as well, such as, all of our file formats, just our management of how our data is stored. Are we going to have to address these in the future? And then what are things that we can't address in the scope of this transfer, such as records come out of a proprietary system in a proprietary file format. It's going to cost excessive amounts of money to go back to the vendor and develop a new solution. That kind of thing does pop up from time to time, and we're not the right people to resolve those type of problems. Those are things to be thinking about in the big picture. And then And then this is kind of a general overview of what we might be talking about when we're talking about processing. Again, not the easiest thing to read. And this is just one section of the workflow. So you'll see as you go through the document, if you do, that there's a lot of different steps that are possible here. And we've tried to identify both the inputs and outputs. Those are the blue. And then the tools are in yellow, and then the individual kind of steps, the things that we're looking for, the individual processes, those are white. So it's nice to kind of take an overview of the things that we're doing. But as you can see, every one of these steps involves potentially a different person doing it, or needing additional pieces of information, or just different kinds of technical expertise or different tool. So anytime there is a change in who or what or how we're doing things, that's kind of a new step in the workflow. And you can go pretty deep on these, especially if you're trying to communicate what you're doing to other members of your staff, or transparently document what you're doing for the public, for our audience. So the second part of the processing is, moving a little bit more into those traditional processing steps. So we want to make sure everything is arranged correctly, meets a structure that can facilitate ingest into the repository. We want to think about description. Are we doing a folder level description? Are we doing an individual file level description? Are we doing more of a bespoke or boutique kind of description for a high value collection? Or are we doing more of an MPLP style, kind of light, just what series, what date, that type of thing? And how do we get those descriptions into our metadata file structure, which Tara was mentioning before? And then what else are we putting into the repository besides our records? Are we putting transfer forms, or correspondence with the producer agency, or our inventory reporting, or anything like that? Is that an attendant to the actual records collection? And then closeout. Once we're finally done processing, we're going to ingest into our repository. That's the point, once it's secure, that we can tell the agency, well, we have it secured here and we're done with it. One, we can show you what it looks like, and two, you can kind of delete your copy. And where the right time to tell them, I think that's a big part of preference, and a big one of the more important factors is just how your relationships with the agencies are. Some of them might not be able to delete it after the fact because the agency might be kind of dissolved, right? And there is no successor; they have to transfer to you. Or, again, this is where those long time frames can come into play, because if it's terabytes and terabytes of data, the agency might not want to wait 2 years to be able to delete it, because they may have to pay the costs. So those are factors we have to consider, and we want to consider it in a structured and repeatable way, and not just think of every project as, well, it's its own thing, because they are all their own things, but we still want to be in the same kind of framework for each one. And then lastly, we come to access, which is, pretty simple questions, which is, when are we going to make them available? How are we going to make them available? Are we making certain things available and other things not? So a really good thing to be thinking about here is your high resolution versus your low resolution. How much are you paying for bandwidth costs? How much are you paying to store data? Are you putting it in something like Amazon Glacier, which is a low cost solution, or S3, which is kind of your high cost solution? So is there actually a difference there, or does it matter? Probably doesn't matter as much for your Word document to PDF, but you've got 100 hours of video, that could be a significant difference in terms of both your storage and your bandwidth. And then lastly, how are we doing restricted material? This is something we're thinking about always in the context of state government, which is, how do we protect those records that have confidential information, but they are still archival? How do we kind of meet the legal requirements that we have and be able to serve those out to our audiences? So those are the things that we are thinking about when we approach this workflow development. And a lot of it comes from exactly what Tara was talking about, which are the requirements that are already in place. Because we know, as part of the archives, that we don't get to decide what technology state government uses. Rarely. We barely even get to decide what technology we get to use. And what the agencies are using, that's a total crapshoot. So, there's a lot of inherent requirements in government, whether they're statutory. Again, we don't really have any say over whether they get changed or not. There's the schedules, which we have some participation in that process, but again, those have been worked on, by a lot of different people, and there's a lot of input and a lot of requirements for those as well. And then the technology and the resources available, we have very little control of those things. So one of the most important things is kind of figuring out where those are. That's why these direct assistance projects are going to meet you where you are. we're not trying to say there's only one way to do this, because there isn't. But there's the way that you have to do it given your responsibilities, and what we want to be able to do as part of Backer and moving forward is turn our best practices into like pragmatic, usable guides so that you can do this yourself. That's where we're going with all this. So thank you. I'll turn it back over to Tara now.
So while we've had a great start, thanks to Nick, things have been slow, which is how things go in state government. So in full transparency, we have not done any large transfers yet. So we've really not put our workflow through its paces. We also have a statute in the state of New Jersey, which requires the materials to be located in the state of New Jersey. So while we will be uploading the materials to Preservica, we are still going to need to maintain a backup server here in New Jersey, and we haven't started that process yet. When it comes to our public interface and the access, we are planning on using Preservica for that, but we are still thinking about how people are going to be accessing our materials. So this is still something that we're still trying to figure out. So there are still many more challenges and questions to come, which is why we're so grateful for SERI and the COSA community, so that we can ask these questions. And we know we've reached out to a number of people who are on this call before, and we've chatted with many people in SERI. So we thank you all for the help that you've already provided us, but please know we will be coming back to you with more questions. And Nick, we will be coming back to you with more questions, but that's where we are for now. So I think at this point, we will open it up for questions and answers, and so people are welcome to put things in the chat. Or if you want to raise your hand, I think Becky can unmute you.
And in the meantime, I'll say that just regarding Backer, if you are in the part of the SERI community, so if you're working in a state or territorial archives, we're doing these direct assistance projects, but I'm on the payroll, so to speak, until the end of the summer. So if you have questions and you want some kind of direct advice, feel free to reach out to me. I think if you go to the COSA website, you can find my email address. I'll also throw it into the chat here. We're happy to get your perspective and help you as much as we can, even in kind of smaller doses. We want to learn what you're doing and how, like I said before, how to translate the work that we've had this wonderful opportunity to work directly with the New Jersey State Archives, but it's just one state archives, right? There's 55 more state and territorial archives out there, and we want to make sure that we can bring the lessons we learned here to you directly in a way that you can use. So please, reach out. It's really important to we can all kind of build our preservation capacity together.
If nobody has any questions, are there any comments for us so far on our workflow? Anything that you see that we can improve on? Any suggestions for us?
Or anything that you're doing differently that we could learn from, because the other thing about this is that we're kind of making it. I don't want to say we're making it up as we go along, but we're trying to use the lessons that we learned to deal with all these weird situations that we encounter with the dozens of agencies and hundreds of software and thousands of file formats and tens of thousands of data structures that we come across.
So we had a question in the chat about was it hard to learn Python? And it wasn't the easiest thing, but luckily I did figure it out. I believe it was one of the conferences. I think it actually was the best practices exchange last year. Someone had suggested using ChatGPT to help understand your code. And that was also a huge help because I could write my code and make sure that I ran it through ChatGPT to see if the code was going to do what I wanted it to do. And it was a lot of trial and error. And it was a lot of sitting in front of my computer, writing code that went absolutely nowhere and then needing to scrap it and start all over again. So it wasn't the easiest thing to learn, but I know there are a few communities out there that are, I think the Bit Curator community is starting to do a Python learning group, so people to kind of learn Python together, which I think would probably be helpful way. I will not say by any means have I learned Python. I've just figured it out enough to get it to wrangle it enough to do what I want to do, which is great. There's another question about, has there been any pushback from agencies about using an FTP server for digital transfers? And I will say that it's really been agencies asking us if we will use their file transfer protocol, their FTP, instead, where they can control the access to it. They're going to give us a login to access their materials. So the agencies really there hasn't been a pushback from that. How we are using the FTP is mainly how we upload the materials to Preservica. But we are willing to work with agencies to take the materials however they are willing to give them to us. Which has been one note that a lot of people have said from the SERI community is kind of and Nick had said this to us as well, is, meet the agencies where they are and how they're willing to give you the materials and work from there. And that has really been important advice for us. We have another question. We have a large backlog of magnetic media that has been collected over the past 40+ years. Do you have any sort of similar backlog? Is there a plan to tackle these sorts of formats for digital preservation for items already received? We do have a backlog of magnetic media that we have not dealt with. We were actually just chatting with Nick about that at the beginning of this, because Nick just came across a whole bunch of magnetic media at his institution and how to deal with it. We do not have any sort of plan on how to process that kind of backlog. We are just trying to, at first, wrap our mind around just the born digital materials. And unfortunately, that means kind of pushing off the magnetic media a little bit, but we want to make sure we understand how to deal with some of our born digital materials, because that's where we are seeing the need from agencies.
We have been lucky enough that most of our magnetic media has come with paper transfers. So a lot of it so far that we've come across, they're photographs or things that we already have, other copies of. So we don't feel that sort of impending doom that they're going to be lost just yet, but I'm sure we'll come across it.
I could speak a little bit to this in my experience. Like, the biggest issue that you're going to have is just, depending on the format, your ability to read it is going to it's not that it's going to decay, but just the availability of the playback and transfer equipment is just going to become more and more scarce. So there are some companies out there that offer professional services for digitization, but they're very pricey. And that's a difficult place that a lot of especially in government that we are, because, it all in all, these type of media tend to represent potentially, a small quantity of what we have, but it's a large expense comparatively to preserve and ultimately provide access to this data. So, there are grants out there that you might be able to apply for, but again, we're talking about, 6-figure or more for the reformatting projects. I know of some states that have gone to their legislature to ask specifically for appropriation for this kind of thing. I don't know if that's available to you, but basically the answer is, where are you going to find the money, because it's going to be expensive.
So it is 3 o'clock and I don't want to keep anybody any longer. So I did just want to say thank you to everybody for attending. Be sure to keep up with the COSA website and SERI websites to check for our resource center and our YouTube page, because we will have this posted. We'll have our slides posted, and we would be happy to answer any questions if you want to send us an email or connect with us in any way. So again, thank you all so much for attending.